In 1866, a 15-year-old boy named Erasmus Jacobs picked up a strange, shiny pebble on the banks of the Orange River in South Africa. His mother thought it was pretty. A neighbor thought it might be worth something. Nobody thought it would end a civilization's oldest illusion. That pebble was a 21-carat diamond. It would later be named the Eureka. Before that moment, diamonds were among the rarest objects on Earth. For most of human history, they came from a handful of riverbeds in India, and later a few scattered deposits in Brazil. Kings wore them. Emperors fought over them. The supply was so thin that a single stone could define a dynasty. Diamonds were rare because there simply weren't very many of them. That scarcity was real, physical, geological. It was not yet a story someone had invented. It was just the truth. The Eureka changed everything because it revealed something the world did not want to admit. South Africa was sitting on more diamonds than all of human history had ever seen combined. Within a few years, prospectors descended on the dry farmland of Griqualand West like locusts. They dug with shovels, picks, and bare hands. They pitched tents in the open veldt. They died of dysentery, heat stroke, and gunfights over 4-foot square claims. It was, in every sense, a diamond rush, cousin to the gold rushes of California and Australia, except the prize here was even smaller, even shinier, and even easier to hide in a pocket and vanish with. By 1871, prospectors found the Motherlode, a hill on a farm owned by two brothers, Johannes and Diederik de Beer. The brothers had no idea what was buried beneath their land. They sold it for a few £1,000 and walked away from history. The site would come to be called the Big Hole, eventually the largest hand-dug excavation on the planet, a crater deep enough to swallow a 50-story building, worked entirely by picks, shovels, and the labor of thousands of men who never saw a fraction of what came out of it. The town that grew around it was named Kimberley, and it became the center of a new industry that, for the first time in history, had access to an almost embarrassing abundance of diamonds. This was the problem nobody wanted to say out loud. Diamonds had always commanded value because they were scarce. Kimberley was proving that they weren't scarce at all. Not really. There were diamonds everywhere in this ground, more than the world's jewelers could conceivably want. If digger after digger kept pulling stones out of the earth and selling them independently, undercutting each other for cash, the price of a diamond would collapse. It would become just another mineral, something like quartz or mica or any of the pretty rocks a person picks up on a riverbank and forgets by evening. Into this chaos walked a sickly, ambitious young Englishman named Cecil John Rhodes. Rhodes had arrived in South Africa in 1870 at 17 years old, sent by his family, in the hope that the dry climate would help his weak lungs and fragile heart. He was the son of a vicar, one of 9 children, unremarkable at school, unremarkable in appearance, pale, awkward, prone to fainting fits that doctors of the era believed meant he wouldn't live past 40. He came to Africa not for gold or diamonds, but simply to breathe. What he found instead was Kimberley, and Kimberley made him. Rhodes started small, renting water pumps to miners struggling with flooding in their claims, a business that made him useful before it made him rich. He used the profits to begin buying up claims himself, methodically, patiently, while other men gambled and drank and burned through their fortunes. He was not the flashiest digger in Kimberley. He was the most disciplined, and discipline in a boomtown built on chaos, was its own form of ruthlessness. Rhodes understood something that most of the men digging around him did not. The real fortune in Kimberley wasn't in finding diamonds. It was in controlling how many diamonds reached the market and at what price. Whoever controlled the flow of stones out of the ground controlled the entire industry. Everyone else was just labor. By the mid-1870s, Rhodes had split his life between Kimberley and Oxford, where he was slowly working toward a degree, absorbing ideas about empire, civilization, and what he believed was the destiny of the British race to rule the world. He carried those ideas back to Africa like a doctrine, but first he needed to win the diamond fields. In 1880, Rhodes formalized his growing collection of claims into a company, De Beers Mining Company, named after the farm where it had all begun. It was one of dozens of small companies competing over the same patch of earth. It would not stay that way for long. The world before De Beers existed was a world where diamonds were valuable because nature had made them scarce. The world Rhodes was about to build would be a world where diamonds stayed valuable because men made them scarce, deliberately, permanently, and by design. There is one more piece of the origin story that cannot be left out, because it explains how Rhodes was able to build any of what came next, labor, and the system built to control it. Kimberley's mines could not have produced the wealth they did without an enormous workforce of African laborers, drawn from across the region by the promise of wages that, however meager, were often better than what subsistence farming offered at home. As the mines deepened and consolidated, the men who ran them, Rhodes very much among them, grew anxious about a specific and profitable problem: theft. A single uncut diamond, small enough to swallow or hide in a wound or a body cavity, could be worth more than a laborer would earn in years. Digging companies estimated they were losing significant value to smuggling every month. Their solution was the closed compound system, pioneered at Kimberley and later exported to gold mines and other extractive industries across southern Africa for generations. African workers were housed in guarded, fenced compounds for the length of their contracts, cut off from the surrounding town, searched thoroughly before release, and denied the freedom of movement that white workers and managers took for granted. It was justified publicly as a defense against theft. In practice, it was one of the earliest large-scale industrial systems of racial control in the region, a forerunner of the pass laws and segregation that would later harden into apartheid. Rhodes himself, during his years as Cape Colony Prime Minister in the 1890s, went on to champion legislation restricting black land ownership and voting rights, laying political groundwork that would outlast him by nearly a century. This is not a footnote to the De Beers story. It is part of the foundation. The company that would go on to convince the world that diamonds represented love and permanence was built, quite literally, by a workforce housed behind fences on land taken through colonial conquest, under a system designed to make sure the wealth flowed in one direction only. Donduad. Part 2. The rise Rhodes' great rival in Kimberley was a man almost his opposite in every way: Barney Barnato. Barnato was a working-class Jewish immigrant from the East End of London, a former music hall performer and boxer who arrived in South Africa with nothing but a crate of cigars to sell and a gift for talking his way into rooms. Where Rhodes was reserved, sickly, and aristocratic in his ambitions, Barnato was loud, street-smart, and relentless. He built his own diamond empire, the Kimberley Central Mining Company, through sheer commercial instinct, eventually controlling the most productive section of the Kimberley mine. For years, Rhodes and Barnato fought each other for dominance the way two predators fight over the same watering hole, not to destroy each other outright, but to establish who fed first. Rhodes wanted consolidation, fewer companies, tighter control, a single entity that could regulate output and defend prices. Barnato, for a long time, resisted. He didn't see the need to merge with anyone. He was doing fine on his own. What changed his mind was money, an amount so large it bordered on absurd. Rhodes, backed by the financial muscle of the Rothschild banking family in London, offered to buy out Barnato's Kimberley Central shares for a staggering sum. By the time the deal closed in 1888, Rhodes had paid roughly £5.3 million sterling. At the time, the largest check ever written. It made him one of the richest men in the world in a single transaction, and it made Barnato his partner instead of his enemy. With Barnato's mine and his own now combined, Rhodes formed De Beers Consolidated Mines Limited in March 1888. The founding charter itself gave a hint of what was coming. It granted the company the extraordinary power to acquire and hold mining rights and interests not just in Kimberley, but essentially anywhere in the world. Rhodes wasn't building a mining company. He was building an instrument for control of an entire global commodity, encoded into legal language, before the company had even mined its first full year of consolidated production. Getting Barnato to that number had taken years of pressure that bordered on siege warfare. Rhodes had spent the mid-1880s quietly buying up smaller claims and neighboring companies around Barnato's holdings, boxing him in, making it progressively more expensive and more difficult for Barnato's Kimberley Central to operate independently. When Barnato tried to counter by buying shares in Rhodes' own company, Rhodes and his bankers arranged a private, oversized allotment of new De Beers shares specifically to dilute Barnato's position and keep control out of his reach, a maneuver that would today draw the immediate attention of securities regulators. But in 1880s, Kimberley was simply good business. By the time the two men sat down to negotiate the amalgamation in 1888, Barnato was not selling from strength. He was selling because Rhodes had made the price of staying independent higher than the price of surrendering. The results were immediate and total. By the end of 1889, De Beers Consolidated Mines controlled effectively all diamond production in South Africa, which meant, since South Africa now produced the overwhelming majority of the world's diamonds, De Beers effectively controlled the entire global diamond supply. From dozens of competing claims to a single monopoly in less than 2 decades. Rhodes had done in Kimberley what oil men in America were doing at almost the exact same time in Pennsylvania and Ohio. He had ended the competition not by outcompeting it, but by absorbing it. But controlling the mines was only half the puzzle. Rhodes and his successors quickly realized that the real threat to prices wasn't the mines at all. It was the market itself. If De Beers dug up diamonds and simply sold everything it found, prices would still crash because too many stones would flood jewelers all at once. The company needed a way to release diamonds slowly, deliberately, regardless of how many were sitting in a vault somewhere. Supply had to be managed like a tap, not a flood. This idea, controlling the release of diamonds rather than merely their extraction, became the central genius of the De Beers system, and it would define the company for the next 100 years. Rhodes did not live to see this system reach its full sophistication. He died in 1902 at 48, his weak heart finally giving out just as he had once been told it would. By then, his ambitions had already expanded far beyond diamonds. He had used his Kimberley fortune to fund the British colonization of vast stretches of Africa, territory so extensive that 2 countries were named after him: Rhodesia, which today are Zambia, and Zimbabwe. He died one of the most powerful and controversial men on the continent, remembered by some as a visionary empire builder, and by many others, particularly the African laborers whose land was seized, and whose bodies filled the compounds of Kimberley, as an architect of colonial exploitation whose legacy would be violently contested for the next century. De Beers, though, outlived him by more than 100 years, and its next great transformation came not from Rhodes, but from a German-born immigrant named Ernest Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer arrived in South Africa in 1902 as a young diamond sorter for a London trading firm, sent to evaluate stones at the source. He was meticulous, quiet, and extraordinarily good with numbers. Over the following 2 decades, he built his own mining interests, founding the Anglo-American Corporation in 1917, with backing from American financiers, including, notably, funding connected to J.P. Morgan to develop South Africa's booming gold industry. But Oppenheimer had his eye on diamonds the entire time. New diamond fields had been discovered in southwest Africa, modern Namibia, and along the Atlantic coast, deposits De Beers did not control. If those diamonds hit the market outside of De Beers' management, the entire pricing structure Rhodes had built could unravel. Oppenheimer understood the stakes immediately. A monopoly that doesn't control all the supply isn't really a monopoly at all. Through a series of patient acquisitions and boardroom maneuvers across the 1920s, Oppenheimer used his Anglo-American fortune to buy up shares in De Beers itself, moving with the same unhurried, methodical patience Rhodes himself had once shown against Barnato half a century earlier, never forcing a confrontation he didn't already know the outcome of, always letting the balance sheet do the negotiating. By 1929, he had done something remarkable. The outsider who had started as a diamond sorter now sat as chairman of the very company that Cecil Rhodes had built. He had captured De Beers from the inside, the same way De Beers had captured Kimberley a generation before. Then came the Great Depression, and Oppenheimer's real genius emerged. Diamond demand collapsed almost overnight in 1930. Mines everywhere, De Beers' own, plus the newer independent fields in West Africa, the Soviet Union, and elsewhere, kept producing stones nobody was buying. If those diamonds hit the market, prices would crater completely, potentially forever. Oppenheimer's solution was audacious. Rather than let the diamonds flow and crash the price, De Beers would simply buy up the world's excess diamond production itself, stockpile it in vaults, and choke off the supply artificially until demand recovered. This required money De Beers didn't fully have during a global depression, and it required something even more valuable: the cooperation, willing or coerced, of diamond producers around the world who were not part of De Beers at all. In 1934, Oppenheimer formalized this arrangement into an entity that would become the true engine of De Beers' 20th century power. the Diamond Trading Company, operating through what became known as the Central Selling Organization, or CSO. The mechanics were elegant in their simplicity. Diamond producers from around the world, South Africa, Southwest Africa, the Belgian Congo, Sierra Leone, Tanzania, eventually the Soviet Union, would sell their entire rough diamond output to the CSO rather than to the open market. The CSO would sort, grade, and value these diamonds, combine them into standardized parcels, and then release them to a hand-picked list of roughly 200 authorized buyers, known within the industry as site holders, at a handful of tightly scheduled events called sites, held 10 times a year in London. Site holders did not negotiate. They were shown a sealed box containing a predetermined selection of diamonds at a price De Beers had already set. They could take the box or leave it, if they left it. If they complained about price or quality or tried to buy diamonds from a competing source outside the CSO, they were quietly removed from the site holder list and never invited back. Since the CSO controlled the overwhelming majority of the world's rough diamond supply, being cut off from it meant being cut off from the diamond business entirely. It was, in effect, a private taxation system for an entire global industry, run out of a boardroom in London with total secrecy and total control. The sites themselves became legendary within the trade for how little power they actually gave the men attending them. A site holder would fly to London, be shown into a quiet room, and be handed a small cardboard or leather box, nicknamed with a certain gallows humor, a site box. Inside sat a selection of rough stones the CSO's own sorters had already assembled, in a mix of sizes and qualities the buyer had no say in curating, priced at a figure printed on an accompanying slip. There was no haggling, there was no counteroffer. A site holder could accept the box as priced, or decline it entirely and walk away. And everyone in the room understood that declining too often or too visibly meant quietly disappearing from the invitation list the following year. Some site holders, over decades, built entire family businesses around simply accepting whatever box London handed them and finding a way to profit from its contents. The system rewarded compliance and punished independence, which was, of course, the entire point. Diamond-producing governments fared little better in the negotiation than the site holders did. Colonial territories and later independent African nations holding newly discovered deposits were offered essentially two choices: sell their entire rough production through the CSO at a set schedule of prices, or attempt to sell independently and watch De Beers use its vast stockpile to release competing stones of similar size and quality onto the market, driving down the price of the outsider's diamonds specifically until the math of independence stopped making sense. Given how few realistic alternative buyers existed for rough diamonds at that scale, most producers eventually came to the table. By the middle of the century, the CSO wasn't simply the biggest player in the diamond trade. For most practical purposes, it was the diamond trade, and everyone else operated only at its discretion. The results were staggering. Through the Depression, through the Second World War, through the post-war boom, De Beers and the CSO ensured that diamond prices almost never fell. Not because diamonds were becoming rarer in the ground. New deposits were being found across Africa and later Russia and Australia with startling regularity, but because the company simply refused to let more diamonds reach buyers than the market could absorb without prices dropping. When new mines were discovered that De Beers didn't own, in the Congo, in Angola, in the Soviet Union, the company's approach was consistent and calculated. Absorb them into the CSO system if possible, and if a producer refused to cooperate, flood the market strategically with De Beers' own stockpiled diamonds of a similar type to crash the price of that specific competitor's stones until they had no choice but to come to the table. It was the same tactic John D. Rockefeller had used against rival oil refiners half a century earlier and an ocean away. Don't just outcompete your rivals, make independence from you more expensive than submission to you. By the middle of the 20th century, this system controlled somewhere between 80 and 90% of the entire world's rough diamond trade. And having secured the supply side so completely, De Beers turned its attention to something even more ambitious: manufacturing demand itself. Das Tunundrast. Part 3. Peak Power. Here is the problem De Beers faced by the 1930s and 40s, one that no amount of supply control could fully solve on its own. Mines all over southern Africa were producing diamonds in quantities the pre-war world had genuinely never needed. There were, quite simply, more diamonds available than there were customers who wanted to buy them. Managing supply could keep the tap from overflowing, but someone still had to make people thirsty. In 1938, De Beers turned to an American advertising agency, N.W. Ayer and Son, and posed a question that sounds almost comic in its audacity. How do you convince every man in America that he must buy a diamond, specifically, in order to prove he loves someone? Ayer's researchers discovered something useful buried in cultural habit. Diamond engagement rings already existed as a tradition dating back centuries in European aristocratic circles, but they were far from universal and far from a fixed expectation. Many couples in America in the early 20th century got engaged with no ring at all, or with a ring featuring another gemstone entirely. Sapphires, rubies, whatever a family could afford or already owned. There was no rule. There was no fixed price point. There was no assumption that a diamond, specifically, was required. Ayer's strategy was to manufacture that assumption from nothing and plant it so deep in American culture that within a generation it would feel like it had always been there. An ancient tradition rather than a mid-century invention. The campaign worked on multiple fronts simultaneously. Ayer placed diamonds in Hollywood films, arranging for stars to wear diamond rings both on screen and in publicity photos, so that audiences absorbed the association between diamonds and glamour, romance, and status without ever being directly told to buy anything. The agency courted magazine editors and fashion writers, feeding them stories about correct engagement traditions that quietly established the diamond ring as the only acceptable choice. It commissioned articles for high school students on the proper etiquette of diamonds, reaching the very demographic who would soon be getting engaged for the first time and instilling the expectation before they'd even begun dating seriously. Crucially, Ayer also invented a metric that had never existed before: a suggested price. The idea that an engagement ring should cost a specific fraction of a man's salary, first pitched as roughly 1 month's salary, later stretched by the industry to 2 or even 3 months' salary in later decades, had no basis in any tradition, any history, any economic logic. It was a number invented to solve a problem. Without some clear benchmark, men might spend too little, and the entire economics of manufactured demand would collapse. So, The industry manufactured a benchmark and marketed it as an old and honorable rule, when in truth it was closer to a corporate sales quota dressed up as etiquette. The campaign's masterstroke came in 1947. A copywriter at Ayer named Francis Garrity, working late one night on yet another De Beers advertisement, wrote down 4 words almost as an afterthought at the bottom of a page. A diamond is forever. It became, by any measure, one of the most successful advertising slogans in history. It did something remarkably clever in just 4 words. It converted the diamond from a mere object of beauty into a symbol of permanence, of a love and a marriage that should never end. And by extension, it discouraged something that would have been catastrophic for De Beers' entire business model: reselling. If a diamond is truly forever, you don't sell it back. You don't trade it in. You keep it, you pass it down, you bury it with your grandmother. The slogan didn't just sell diamonds. It quietly strangled the second-hand market that could have otherwise competed with new stones and exposed the arbitrary nature of diamond pricing to easy comparison. The campaign did not stop with weddings. Through the 1950s, 60s, and beyond, De Beers' marketing machine methodically layered diamonds into every major emotional milestone it could identify. Engagement rings, obviously, but also eternity rings for anniversaries, diamond earrings as symbols of a father's love for a daughter, diamond pendants marketed for no occasion at all beyond a partner wanting to express affection. Each campaign followed the same underlying formula Ayer had perfected: connect the stone not to its actual mineral scarcity, but to an emotion so significant that questioning the price would feel like questioning the emotion itself. Who wants to be the person calculating cost per carat while proposing marriage? It worked on a scale that transformed entire national cultures. In the United States, diamond engagement rings went from a minority custom in the 1930s to an overwhelming societal default by the 1950s, with the vast majority of American brides receiving one. And having conquered America, De Beers took the exact same playbook overseas. Japan, in particular, had no tradition of diamond engagement rings whatsoever before the 1960s. Within about 2 decades of a coordinated De Beers marketing campaign there, the majority of Japanese brides were receiving diamond rings, an entire nation's courtship customs reshaped by advertising within a single generation. By the second half of the 20th century, the numbers behind this operation were almost impossible to comprehend. De Beers and the Central Selling Organization, at their peak, controlled somewhere in the range of 80 to 90% of the world's rough diamond trade, passing through their system. 10 sites a year in London decided, essentially, how many diamonds the entire planet would see. Site holders, the roughly 200-odd chosen buyers, represented the only legitimate gateway into the world's diamond supply, and the loyalty they showed the company bordered on religious, because the alternative to loyalty was professional extinction. Entire multi-generational diamond-cutting dynasties in Antwerp, Tel Aviv, and Mumbai built their livelihoods around nothing more than the continued goodwill of a handful of De Beers sorters in London, men whose personal judgment on parcel quality and pricing could make or break a family business built up over 3 generations, with no appeal, no arbitration, and no alternative supplier waiting in the wings. Within the trade, De Beers commanded a mixture of fear and grudging respect that few companies in any industry have ever matched. Governments of entire diamond-producing nations found themselves negotiating with De Beers almost as equals to a foreign power because De Beers effectively was the market. There was no meaningful alternative buyer, no rival cartel, no other door to walk through. Independent producers who tried to sell outside the system found their diamonds suddenly worth far less, undercut by De Beers releasing similar stones from its vast stockpile until the rebels came back into the fold. De Beers' marketing budget through these decades ran into tens of millions of dollars annually, an extraordinary sum for a company that, technically, produced no consumer products at all. It mined and sorted rough stones, then sold them wholesale to cutters and jewelers who did the actual retailing. De Beers was, in effect, paying to advertise an entire category on behalf of thousands of jewelers worldwide who never spent a cent on it themselves, all so that the underlying commodity those jewelers depended on would keep climbing in perceived value year after year. It was advertising not for a specific product, but for an idea. The idea that a diamond, any diamond from any jeweler, was worth what was being asked for it. The campaign also reached into Hollywood at a level of coordination that would raise eyebrows today. Ayer's staff maintained relationships with major studios, arranging for diamonds to be loaned to films and worn by leading actresses in premieres and publicity stills, embedding the stone in the visual language of glamour so thoroughly that audiences absorbed the association without ever seeing a single overt advertisement. Gossip columns were fed quiet suggestions about which stars had received diamonds from which suitors. Etiquette columns in women's magazines were shaped, sometimes with direct input from the campaign's own writers, to present the diamond ring not as one option among several, but as the only choice a serious suitor would consider. This was not advertising in the sense of a billboard or a magazine spread. It was closer to what would later be called native content, marketing so thoroughly woven into ordinary culture that it stopped looking like marketing at all, and ordinary consumers, the millions of men walking into jewelry stores around the world to buy engagement rings, had almost no idea that any of this existed. They believed, entirely sincerely, that they were buying into an ancient tradition and a naturally scarce, precious stone. They did not know that the price they were paying had been shaped for decades by a boardroom in London, that the rarity of their purchase was closer to a carefully managed illusion than a geological fact, and that the very idea that they were supposed to buy a diamond at all had been placed in their heads, quite deliberately, one generation earlier. That gap between what the world believed about diamonds and what was actually happening behind the scenes was the truest measure of De Beers' power. A company doesn't reach the height of dominance when it controls an industry. It reaches the height of dominance when the public doesn't even realize an industry is being controlled at all. Part 4. Conflict Power. At that scale does not go unnoticed forever, and for De Beers, the reckoning arrived from several directions at once: American antitrust law, geopolitics, and eventually the company's own product turning into a moral liability. Even before Angola and Sierra Leone, De Beers had faced an earlier wartime controversy that governments were slower to forgive than consumers ever learned to notice. During the Second World War, industrial-grade diamonds were essential to Allied manufacturing, used to cut and grind the machine tools that built aircraft engines, munitions, and precision instruments. Supply of these industrial stones ran overwhelmingly through De Beers and its associated companies. Wartime investigators and later historians raised pointed questions about how tightly the company controlled that supply, even as Allied war production strained for every diamond-tipped tool it could obtain, with some American officials privately suspicious that a monopoly accustomed to profiting from scarcity had little incentive to flood a market, wartime emergency or not. No definitive proof of deliberate wartime sabotage was ever established, but the episode hardened suspicion in Washington that would resurface with much sharper teeth in the antitrust battles still to come. The United States represented an enormous diamond market. American consumers, thanks to decades of De Beers' own marketing, bought a huge share of the world's diamond jewelry. But it was also the one major market De Beers could never fully control from the inside, because American antitrust law took a very dim view of exactly the kind of price-fixing cartel the CSO represented. In 1945, the United States Department of Justice filed an antitrust case against De Beers, alleging that the company and its affiliates had conspired to restrain trade in industrial diamonds. Then in 1994, a federal grand jury indicted De Beers on charges of conspiring with General Electric to fix prices of industrial diamonds used in manufacturing. De Beers' response was, in its own way, as revealing as the case itself. Rather than send executives to face trial on American soil, where they could be arrested and prosecuted personally, the company simply refused to appear. For decades, senior De Beers leadership avoided setting foot in the United States altogether, conducting American diamond business entirely through intermediaries and subsidiaries structured to keep the parent company itself technically outside the reach of American courts. This wasn't cowardice. It was a calculated legal strategy that worked for the better part of 60 years. De Beers effectively operated as an untouchable entity on the world's largest diamond-consuming market, present everywhere in spirit and nowhere in person. It was, in its own quiet way, one of the most brazen displays of corporate power in modern history. A company so essential to an entire product category that it could simply decline to acknowledge the laws of the country buying most of its product and face no meaningful consequence for decades. That eventually changed. In 2004, De Beers finally pleaded guilty to the 1994 price-fixing charge involving industrial diamonds, agreeing to pay a $10 million fine to resolve the matter, and in doing so, formally re-entering the American market on legal footing for the first time in decades. But by then, a far larger threat to De Beers' image had already emerged. One that had nothing to do with courtrooms and everything to do with blood. Through the 1990s, brutal civil wars tore through diamond-producing African nations, including Angola, Sierra Leone, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. In each case, armed rebel factions and warlords seized control of diamond mining areas and used the proceeds from smuggled rough diamonds to fund horrific campaigns of violence, buying weapons, paying soldiers, and in Sierra Leone in particular, financing a conflict notorious for the mutilation of civilians, including children whose limbs were amputated as a campaign of terror. In Angola, the rebel movement UNITA, led by Jonas Savimbi, financed decades of civil war, partly through control of diamond-rich territory, at times generating hundreds of millions of dollars a year in diamond revenue, even as United Nations sanctions attempted to choke off exactly that funding stream. In Sierra Leone, the Revolutionary United Front seized the country's diamond fields and used the proceeds to sustain a war defined by its deliberate campaign of terror against civilians, forced conscription of child soldiers, and the amputation of hands and limbs used specifically to spread fear across the countryside and suppress voting. The connection between these atrocities and a shiny stone destined for a jewelry counter thousands of miles away was, for most of the 1990s, something the diamond trade preferred not to examine too closely. These stones became known globally as conflict diamonds or blood diamonds, and investigative journalists and human rights organizations, particularly the NGO Global Witness beginning in the late 1990s, began tracing the supply chains that connected these war-torn mines to ordinary jewelry stores in London, New York, and Tokyo. The uncomfortable truth that emerged was that a portion of the diamonds De Beers and other dealers had purchased over the years, knowingly or through willful lack of scrutiny, had passed through hands stained with exactly this kind of violence. The revelations landed as a gut punch to the entire romantic mythology the A Diamond Is Forever campaign had spent 60 years constructing. Diamonds had been sold to the world as the ultimate symbol of love, permanence, and purity. Now, the public was learning that some of those same stones may have financed massacres and mutilations on another continent. It was, in narrative terms, close to the worst possible juxtaposition an industry built entirely on sentiment could face. The backlash was swift, amplified further by the 2006 Hollywood film Blood Diamond, starring Leonardo DiCaprio, which dramatized the conflict diamond trade for a mass audience and did more to plant the phrase blood diamond in everyday vocabulary than any journalistic report had managed on its own. Consumer awareness of conflict diamonds spiked, and jewelers around the world suddenly faced customers asking a question that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. Can you actually prove where this stone came from? The diamond industry, De Beers very much included, faced an existential threat to consumer trust and moved to contain it through a coordinated international response. The Kimberley Process Certification Scheme, established in 2003 through negotiations between governments, the diamond industry, and civil society organizations. The Kimberley process required participating countries to certify that shipments of rough diamonds were conflict-free, using a chain of custody system intended to prevent blood diamonds from entering the legitimate global supply chain. It was, by most honest accounts, an imperfect fix. Critics pointed out that the certification relied heavily on individual governments' own diamond mining sectors, self-reporting compliance, that smuggling routes could still slip stones past inspection points, and that the definition of conflict diamond used by the Kimberley process narrowly covered stones financing rebel movements against recognized governments while doing little to address other serious human rights abuses within the industry, including forced labor and violence committed by government forces themselves, rather than rebels. Even so, the Kimberley process gave the industry, and De Beers specifically, something it needed badly: a defensible public answer to a question that threatened to poison the entire product category. Meanwhile, an entirely separate front was opening against De Beers' commercial dominance, this one economic rather than moral. For decades, the CSO cartel had depended on the cooperation, willing or coerced, of the world's major diamond producers. But new geopolitical and corporate realities were eroding that cooperation. Australia's massive Argyle mine, discovered in the 1980s and famous for producing the overwhelming majority of the world's rare pink diamonds alongside vast quantities of smaller commercial stones, initially sold through the CSO but eventually broke away in the 1990s to market its diamonds independently. One of the first major producers to prove that life outside the De Beers system was commercially survivable. Rio Tinto and BHP Billiton, two of the world's largest mining conglomerates, entered the diamond business directly with the resources and international reach to bypass the CSO system entirely, rather than submit to De Beers pricing terms. Most significantly, after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russia's diamond industry centered on the state-controlled company that would become known as Alrosa, mining vast deposits in Siberia, gradually shifted away from the exclusive supply arrangements the USSR had maintained with De Beers during the Cold War, eventually moving toward independent marketing of Russian rough diamonds on the open market. Since Russia represented one of the largest diamond-producing nations on Earth, losing this cooperation meaningfully weakened De Beers' ability to single-handedly regulate the world's total diamond supply. By the early 2000s, the arrangement Ernest Oppenheimer had built 70 years earlier, a single organization managing the overwhelming majority of the planet's rough diamond flow, was fracturing beyond the point where it could be patched back together. De Beers' market share of global rough diamond production, once estimated at 80 to 90%, had fallen dramatically into a range closer to 35 to 40% by the 2000s and 2010s. The monopoly wasn't destroyed by a single antitrust ruling or a single scandal. It was worn down gradually by competitors it could no longer absorb or intimidate, by a legal environment that finally caught up with its practices, and by a public that, for the first time, was learning to ask uncomfortable questions about where its symbols of love actually came from. Part 5. Transformation. Facing a market it could no longer command through brute monopoly power, De Beers made a decision that would have been unthinkable to Cecil Rhodes or even Ernest Oppenheimer. It chose to stop hiding and reinvent itself as something closer to an ordinary, if still very large, public company. In 2000, De Beers formally abandoned its decades-old strategy of trying to control the entire world's diamond supply and buy up every excess stone to prop up prices. Instead, the company adopted what it called a supplier of choice strategy. Rather than dominating the market through stockpiling and coercion, De Beers would compete on branding, quality assurance, and its own retail presence, positioning itself as simply the best and most trusted option among several legitimate suppliers, rather than the only option available. This shift was formalized through a major corporate restructuring in 2001, when De Beers was taken private in a deal involving Anglo American, the Oppenheimer family, and the government of Botswana, itself a major diamond-producing nation, and, notably, a De Beers partner whose diamond wealth had helped fund significant national development, making Botswana something of an unusual case study in resource wealth benefiting a producing nation rather than simply enriching a distant corporation. The Botswana relationship deserves its own mention because it complicates the otherwise straightforward story of extraction and exploitation that runs through so much of De Beers' history. Since the discovery of major diamond deposits there in the late 1960s, shortly after Botswana's independence from Britain, the government negotiated a joint venture with De Beers, eventually formalized as Debswana, that gave the state a direct and substantial share of diamond revenue rather than merely a royalty on someone else's profit. Successive Botswana governments used that revenue to fund education, healthcare, and infrastructure at a scale that helped transform one of the poorest countries in Africa at independence into one of the continent's stronger economies by the early 21st century. It did not erase the broader, harsher pattern of resource extraction that defined De Beers' history elsewhere on the continent, and Botswana's heavy dependence on a single commodity brought its own long-term risks. But it stood as a rare case where a diamond-producing nation captured enough of the value for itself to visibly reshape its own future, rather than watching that value flow entirely to a foreign boardroom. De Beers also moved directly into retail for the first time in its history, launching a chain of De Beers-branded jewelry stores through a joint venture with the French luxury conglomerate LVMH beginning in 2001, an extraordinary reversal for a company that had spent a century controlling the industry from behind the curtain of anonymous wholesale sites, now putting its own name directly on the storefront glass for consumers to see. Ownership continued to shift through the 2000s and 2010s. Anglo-American, the mining giant Ernest Oppenheimer had founded back in 1917, gradually increased its stake in De Beers, eventually acquiring the Oppenheimer family's remaining shares entirely in 2012 for roughly $5.1 billion, bringing to a close nearly a century of direct Oppenheimer family control over the company that Patriarch had captured from Cecil Rhodes' original vision back in 1929. Anglo-American, alongside the government of Botswana, became De Beers' primary owners going forward. But the most existential challenge to De Beers' business in the 21st century didn't come from rival mining companies or antitrust regulators or even reputational scandal. It came from a laboratory. Advances in technology made it possible to grow diamonds artificially. Lab-grown diamonds, chemically and structurally identical to mined stones, indistinguishable to the naked eye, and, at the atomic level, virtually indistinguishable from natural diamonds even to many gemological instruments without specialized equipment. Unlike cheap imitations like cubic zirconia that had existed for decades, lab-grown diamonds were real diamonds by any honest chemical definition, just manufactured in weeks in a facility rather than formed over billions of years by intense heat and pressure deep in the Earth's mantle. This posed a uniquely dangerous threat to the entire pricing philosophy De Beers had spent a century building, because lab-grown diamonds could be produced at a small fraction of the cost of mining, cutting, and transporting natural stones without the geological scarcity that had once been diamonds' only truly organic source of value. If consumers accepted lab-grown diamonds as equally legitimate, an entire industry's pricing structure, built on managed scarcity, decades of marketing, and the emotional premium of natural rarity, risked collapsing much the way synthetic gemstones had already devalued other, less culturally reinforced stones. De Beers' response to this threat revealed the company's continuing instinct for controlling a narrative rather than simply competing on price. Initially, the company's public messaging leaned heavily on distinguishing natural diamonds as authentic and meaningful, precisely because of their rarity and geological origin, implicitly positioning lab-grown alternatives as a lesser, less real symbol of commitment. Then, in a move that stunned much of the industry, De Beers reversed course entirely. In 2018, the company launched its own lab-grown diamond brand, called Lightbox, selling laboratory-grown diamonds at a fraction of the price of natural stones, explicitly undercutting the very premium pricing structure the natural diamond side of its own business depended on. It was, in effect, De Beers competing against itself, a company hedging its future by entering the very market segment that threatened to erode its core business, rather than simply denying that segment's legitimacy and hoping it would fade away. The strategy reflected a company that understood something Cecil Rhodes had understood back in 1880's Kimberley, and that Ernest Oppenheimer had understood in the depths of the 1930s Depression. When you cannot stop a force reshaping your market, the next best option is to make sure you're the one profiting from that reshaping, rather than being destroyed by a competitor who gets there first. Today, De Beers exists as a very different entity from the singular, secretive global monopoly Rhodes and Oppenheimer built. It no longer controls anywhere near the overwhelming share of world diamond supply it once commanded. It competes, sometimes uneasily, against Alrosa, against Rio Tinto's and other conglomerates' diamond operations, and against the fast-growing lab-grown diamond sector, including its own subsidiary. It operates in a world shaped by the Kimberley process, by consumer skepticism the company itself helped provoke through decades of controversy, and by a public far more willing to question the industry's claims than the generation that first heard "a diamond is forever" in 1947. Nahawara, Part 6, Legacy. The legacy of De Beers is not really a story about diamonds at all. It is a story about the manufacturing of desire, and what happens when a private company gains enough power to reshape not just a market, but a culture's most intimate rituals. For the diamond industry itself, De Beers' century of dominance left behind both the infrastructure of a global business and the scars of its methods. The Kimberley process, imperfect as it remains, exists directly because of controversies De Beers was deeply entangled in, and it represents one of the more significant instances of international regulators, industry, and civil society jointly attempting to police an entire global supply chain for ethical sourcing, a template that other industries, from cobalt mining to conflict minerals in electronics, have since studied and in places imitated. For antitrust law and global regulation, De Beers stands as one of the most instructive case studies of the 20th century in how a cartel can operate legally, or at least in legal gray zones, across international borders, even while facing direct prosecution in individual countries. The fact that De Beers avoided meaningful American legal accountability for the better part of 60 years by simply keeping its executives off American soil remains a striking illustration of the limits of national law when confronting genuinely global corporate power. A lesson regulators grappling with modern multinational technology and finance companies have had occasion to relearn in different forms ever since. But De Beers' most lasting legacy is cultural, and it is one that nearly everyone alive today has personally inherited without ever having chosen it. The overwhelming majority of the world's engagement customs involving diamond rings in the United States, in Japan, and in dozens of other countries exist not because of some ancient tradition stretching back to antiquity, but because a mid-20th century advertising campaign commissioned by a mining monopoly with an unsold surplus problem successfully convinced entire nations that this was how love was supposed to be expressed. The specific benchmark still sometimes cited today, that a ring should cost some fraction of a month's or 2 months' salary, traces back not to romance, but to a corporate sales target invented to solve an inventory problem in the late 1930s. This is, in its own way, one of the most successful feats of narrative engineering in modern commercial history. Not simply selling a product, but successfully rewriting what an entire civilization believes love is supposed to look like, so thoroughly that the invention itself became invisible, mistaken by nearly everyone for tradition. And underneath all of it lies the deeper, stranger truth the Eureka diamond first hinted at, back in 1866, on the banks of the Orange River. Diamonds were never quite as rare as the world was led to believe. Vast quantities of them sat beneath South African soil, and later beneath Russian tundra, Australian outback, and Canadian permafrost. More than enough to satisfy the entire planet's jewelry demands many times over, at prices far lower than what generations of consumers actually paid. The scarcity that defined the value of a diamond for most of the 20th century was not a fact of nature. It was a fact of management, carefully, deliberately, and profitably constructed by a company that understood long before most industries did that controlling a market's supply is powerful, but controlling a market's story is more powerful still. There is also a quieter legacy, one that has less to do with diamonds specifically, and more to do with what De Beers proved was possible for any company willing to think in decades rather than quarters. Long before modern brand strategists spoke of creating demand or owning a category, De Beers had already run the experiment at global scale and confirmed the result. A determined company, given enough time, enough secrecy, and enough control over both supply and story, can install an idea so deeply into a culture that the culture forgets the idea was ever installed at all. Later industries, from bottled water convincing entire nations that tap water needed a premium alternative, to breakfast cereal companies, inventing the idea that cereal was the incomplete, essential start to every morning, followed variations of the same playbook De Beers perfected first and executed most completely. Whether that makes De Beers a cautionary tale or a case study in marketing genius likely depends on which side of the sight box a person imagines themselves standing. Cecil Rhodes built an empire on a hole in the ground. Ernest Oppenheimer built a global cartel on a vault full of unsold stones. And somewhere in between, an anonymous copywriter in a New York office, tasked with selling an oversupply of a mineral nobody strictly needed, wrote 4 words that outlived them both and convinced the world that scarcity, like love, could be manufactured and sold back to it, 1 ring at a time. That is the real story of De Beers, not a company that discovered how rare diamonds were, a company that discovered how easily the world could be convinced they were.